Imagine a rich park in the city center. A glamorous woman in an exquisite dress laughs at a homeless man sitting on a bench in shabby clothes. Passers-by look away, not wanting to interfere. Suddenly, Keanu Reeves appears, and his action changes this moment forever. What he does next shocks everyone. In the center of the city, among the high-rise buildings and fashionable shops, there was a luxurious park. This place was known for its well-groomed paths, flower beds, and fountains. Wealthy residents of the city often came here to relax, take a walk, or simply enjoy the beauty of nature, surrounded by elite society. But this park was not only for the privileged. On its benches you could often see those who had much less than others. One sunny morning, the park came alive with people strolling along the paths, jogging, holding coffee from expensive coffee shops, and children playing by the fountain. On one of the benches near the park's central square, a man in shabby clothes sat. His jacket looked as if it had survived more than one season. His pants were worn out, and his shoes had long since lost their appearance. His face was tired, with a slight tinge of sadness. Next to him stood an old backpack containing, apparently, all his belongings. The man sat silently, watching the people around him. He looked peaceful, not attracting too much attention, but his presence was noticeable. Some passers-by gave him sideways glances, while others deliberately looked away to avoid contact. This was a familiar reaction for him, and he had long since stopped paying attention to it. Meanwhile, a woman entered the park. She looked like the epitome of luxury. Her dress was made of the most expensive fabrics, and the jewelry on her neck and wrists sparkled in the sun. She was holding a designer bag in one hand and coffee in a branded cup in the other. Her posture was proud and her gait confident. The woman was clearly someone who was used to comfort and attention. Walking through the park, she noticed a man on a bench. Her gaze settled on him, and her face twisted into an expression of disdain. The woman stopped a few meters away from the bench, assessing his appearance. Her eyes ran over his jacket, backpack, and worn-out shoes. She raised her eyebrows and shook her head slightly, as if she couldn't believe that someone like that could be in this park. The man, who had been looking at the fountain until then, noticed that he was being looked at. He turned his head and met her gaze. His face remained neutral, but his eyes were slightly alert. The woman did not look away. She took a few steps forward, moving closer to the bench. Her expression remained arrogant and her gait confident. Other park visitors began to stop around them. Some watched with interest. Others pretended not to notice. The atmosphere began to change. The calm morning was gradually filled with tension. The woman stopped right in front of the bench, as if to demonstrate her superiority. Her presence seemed to be a challenge, and the people around her felt it. She stood there, coffee in hand, and continued to assess the man. Her gesture, a slight lift of her chin, looked as if she considered herself the mistress of this park. The man, on the other hand, remained calm. His face did not express any emotion, but his eyes were intent. He remained silent, realizing that any response could only escalate the situation. Soon the woman made the first step that changed the atmosphere. She glanced at his backpack and smiled dismissively. Her smile was short, but everyone watching noticed it. This gesture became a signal to others. She was openly demonstrating her attitude. People began to whisper, discussing what was happening. The woman began to slowly walk around the bench, still looking at the man. Her movements were confident, but at the same time full of contempt. She was doing everything she could to draw attention to herself, and she was succeeding. Passers-by stopped to look at the scene unfolding in front of them. The man, realizing that he was the center of attention, remained calm. He didn't react to the woman, but his gaze would occasionally rest on the people around him. He saw their faces, full of curiosity, but also indifference. No one was in a hurry to intervene. This was not new to him. People were used to watching but not acting. The sun rose higher and higher, illuminating the scene. The shadows of the trees fell on the paths, creating a contrast between light and darkness. This contrast was a reflection of what was happening in the park. Wealth and poverty, arrogance and calm, contempt, and patience. The man remained seated as if he were part of the landscape, but at the same time his presence broke the perfect picture. The woman stopped in front of the bench again. She gave the man one last dismissive glance and took a sip of coffee. Her posture remained unwavering, but there was a shadow of dissatisfaction in her eyes. She seemed to be expecting some kind of reaction, but there was none. The man remained silent, and this only increased the tension. More people gathered around them. Some were filming what was happening on their phones, while others just stood and watched. The atmosphere in the park changed. It seemed that everyone was waiting for the scene to end. But so far, nothing was happening. The woman and the man remained in their roles. She was a symbol of superiority, and he was the personification of calm. As the woman who stopped in front of the homeless man continued to demonstrate her superiority, the situation gradually escalated. The people standing around watched in silence, but their gazes were full of mixed feelings. Some condemned the woman, while others simply watched the events indifferently. The homeless man, trying not to pay attention to the situation, continued to sit, looking at the fountain, which shimmered in the morning sun. The woman suddenly bent down, as if she was looking for something near the bench. Her actions were quick and demonstrative, and it attracted even more attention. She straightened up, holding a piece of cardboard on which the homeless man had apparently written a few words. Her face expressed indignation. She held up the cardboard, as if she wanted everyone around her to see it. The sign read in large letters, "I need help. Even the smallest kindness makes a difference." The woman smiled sarcastically and asked loudly if anyone really believed in such words. Her voice was cold, but loud enough to be heard by everyone around her. Her behavior was full of disdain, and it evoked different emotions in those present. Some of the passers-by looked uncomfortable, some whispered quietly, but no one intervened. The homeless man sat silently. He didn't look at the woman, only occasionally casting brief glances at the people watching them. His face remained calm, but his eyes showed sadness and lack of hope. He did not try to justify himself or respond to her words. This was his usual tactic, staying on the sidelines, not getting involved in conflicts. The sun was rising higher and higher, and the shadows from the trees created bizarre patterns on the paths. The woman continued to stand in front of the bench, holding the cardboard and twisting it defiantly in her hands. Her movements were abrupt, and each gesture expressed her disdain. She seemed to be enjoying the attention she was drawing. People kept stopping, forming a kind of circle around her and the homeless man. Suddenly, a new visitor appeared in the park. He was a middle-aged man dressed in simple but neat clothes. He was carrying a bag of groceries that he had obviously just bought at a nearby store. His gait was confident, but not hurried. It was Keanu Reeves, who was casually strolling through the city and decided to go to the park. Keanu immediately noticed the crowds and the unusual atmosphere. He stopped for a moment, assessing the situation, and then slowly walked toward the group. His face remained calm but attentive. As he got closer, his attention was drawn to a woman standing with cardboard in her hands and a man sitting on a bench. Keanu stopped a few meters away from the stage and began to watch. He immediately realized what was happening. His face remained neutral, but there was a shadow of disappointment in his eyes. He knew that such situations happened often, but each time they caused him to feel strong emotions. The woman, noticing that a new visitor had approached the group, gave him a quick glance. She did not seem to recognize Keanu and continued her demonstration. She addressed the crowd, asking why they were allowing homeless people to take up space in the park and spoil the view of such a beautiful place. Her words were harsh and even aggressive, and it made people even more uncomfortable. Keanu, still standing aside, slowly put his bag on the ground. He took a few steps forward, coming closer to the woman. His movements were smooth but confident. People began to pay attention to him, but he was in no hurry to draw unnecessary attention to himself. When Keanu stopped in front of the bench, the woman finally paid attention to him. Her expression changed to one of surprise, but she quickly regained her confidence. She looked at him curiously, obviously not realizing who he was. Her gaze, however, expressed a slight wariness, as if she felt that the man might interfere with her performance. Keanu looked at the woman, then turned his gaze to the homeless man. His face remained calm, but a warm and sympathetic expression appeared in his eyes. He met the homeless man's eyes for a moment, who looked up at him. There was something in that look that made the man relax a little. Keanu didn't say a word, but his presence began to change the atmosphere. The people standing around stopped whispering and began to watch him closely. The woman looked a little embarrassed, but still held the cardboard in her hands as if trying to maintain her position. After a short pause, Keanu made a gesture that changed everything. He went down on one knee in front of the bench and began to talk calmly to the homeless man. His movements were gentle, and his voice was calm and quiet. He took a bottle of water out of his bag and handed it to the man, who accepted it with a bit of surprise. Keanu then pulled out some food and put it next to the homeless man. The woman, watching this, looked confused. Her face expressed a mixture of emotions: surprise, anger, and even a little shame. People around her began to quietly discuss what was happening. Someone took out a phone and started filming. The woman, who was still holding the cardboard, could not hide her confusion. Her self-confidence began to melt away as she saw other people watching Keanu Reeves' actions with interest. Her eyes were full of doubt, but she didn't back down. She felt that she could still turn the attention back to herself and regain her position in this situation. Keanu, meanwhile, continued to talk calmly to the homeless man. He took his time, his gestures were warm and friendly. The homeless man, who had looked wary at first, gradually began to relax. His gaze, which had been full of sadness and despair, now expressed a slight surprise. A person who seemed to be far from his world was showing him sincere attention and support. More and more people gathered around them. Passers-by, who had been rushing about their business up to that point, were now stopping to see what was happening. Some took out their phones and started recording what they were seeing. There was a sense of anticipation in the air. Everyone realized that this moment was more than just a random scene in the park. The woman, watching the attention shift to Keanu and the homeless man, began to get nervous. Her attempt to humiliate the man backfired. She took a few steps back, as if trying to avoid people's gazes. But her movements were abrupt, and this only drew more attention to her. Keanu got up from his knee and turned to the people standing around him. His gaze was calm, but penetrating. He met the eyes of each person standing next to him for a moment. It was a silent call to action that made people think about what they had just seen. Meanwhile, one of the women in the crowd, holding a small child by the hand, stepped forward. She looked at the homeless man, then at Keanu, and sighed. She took a small bag of food from her bag and handed it to the man. Her example inspired others. People began to come up and offer their help. Some shared food, some gave money, and some simply expressed words of support. The woman who initiated the scene looked increasingly embarrassed. She threw the cardboard on the ground and quickly walked away without a word. Her figure disappeared behind the trees, and with it the sense of tension she had created. Keanu looked after her, but said nothing. He turned back to the homeless man, who now looked more confident. In front of him was a pile of food, drinks, and small change that people had left for him. His eyes were shining, and it was clear that he could hardly hold back tears. He quietly thanked everyone who came up to him and lowered his head as if he could not believe that all this had happened. The situation in the park began to change. People no longer walked past the homeless man, pretending that he did not exist. They stopped, talked to him, asked if there was anything else they could do to help. Several people even offered to help him find a place in a shelter or a job. It was something he did not expect and made him believe in humanity again. One of the men who approached Keanu asked why he decided to intervene. Keanu smiled and said, "Because everyone deserves respect. Sometimes all you need to do is take the first step to make a difference." His words elicited applause from those standing nearby. It was a moment that remained in the memory of everyone who witnessed the scene. When the crowd began to disperse, the homeless man remained sitting on the bench, but now he looked different. His posture became straighter, and a glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. He lifted his head and looked up at the sky, as if for the first time in a long time he felt part of this world. Keanu picked up the bag of groceries he had left on the ground and approached the homeless man. He stretched out his hand and said, "Hold on, and don't forget that there are always people who are willing to help." The man shook his hand, and at that moment a connection was established between them that did not require words. After that, Keanu left the park. He walked quietly, head slightly tilted, avoiding unnecessary attention. But the people who saw him do this talked about it for a long time. Some shared the video on social media. Others discussed the situation with their friends. The story of that day in the park spread quickly, becoming a symbol of how a simple act of kindness can change the world. When Keanu Reeves left the park, his figure disappeared among the trees, but the impact of his actions remained. People who witnessed the scene continued to discuss what happened, telling their friends and family. The incident became public not only among those present in the park, but also on social media, where a video of the moment went viral. The video showed Keanu talking to a homeless man, giving him food and convincing passers-by to help. This caused a wave of positive feedback in the comments. People wrote about the importance of being human and how one simple act can inspire others to do good. However, at the same time, there were also comments condemning the behavior of the rich woman. Her actions became a symbol of indifference and arrogance, which sparked a broader discussion about social inequality. The woman who left the park after the confrontation also saw the videos. Her image, although not very clear, was accompanied by many negative comments. She felt a shame she had never known before. At home, in her large apartment, she could not look away from the screen, where her face was part of a story that was being discussed by thousands. She was filled with mixed emotions: anger, shame, and even envy at how easily Keanu was able to change the atmosphere of the park. The next day, the woman decided to return to the park. She didn't know why she was doing it, but she felt she had to. Dressed less conspicuously, she walked along the familiar path where the events had taken place. Her heart beat faster when she noticed that the bench where the homeless man was sitting was empty. Everything around her looked calm, but it was a calm that only emphasized the weight of the event that had happened here the day before. As she stood there, thinking about her actions, an elderly woman approached her. She was dressed simply, but her eyes radiated warmth. The elderly woman asked if she was the same person who was here yesterday. The woman nodded, and at that moment her heart clenched with guilt. The old woman did not look judgmental. She just said, "Yesterday was an important lesson for all of us. You can do something to fix it." These words penetrated the woman's soul, and she realized that her actions had consequences. She decided to find that homeless man. She had a desire in her heart to correct her mistake, although she did not fully understand how to do it. She started asking people in the park if they had seen him. Several visitors mentioned that they had seen him sitting by the fountain early in the morning, but then he left. She headed in that direction, hoping to find him. Meanwhile, the homeless man everyone was talking about also felt a change. After people in the park started helping him, he realized that the world was not as indifferent as he thought. He found shelter for the night at a local charity organization, where he was offered a hot meal and a place to rest. In the morning, he woke up with the feeling that his life could change. It was a rare moment of hope that he had long since lost. The homeless man decided to return to the park. He wanted to see the people who had helped him yesterday, and maybe thank them. When he arrived at the park, he saw the same woman who had abused him. She looked completely different. Her posture was no longer so proud, and there was something like remorse in her eyes. She approached him and began to speak. Her words were filled with apologies, and she admitted that her behavior was unacceptable. She offered her help, saying that she wanted to correct her mistakes. This meeting was a turning point for both of them. For the homeless man, it was a sign that people can change, and for the woman, it was an opportunity to rethink her life. They talked for a long time, and in the end she offered to find him stable help. She contacted a local charity organization that helped people find housing and jobs. Her act was sincere, and it helped her regain some of her dignity. When the news of this spread, social media again exploded with comments. People appreciated that the woman had recognized her mistakes and made an attempt to rectify the situation. The homeless man received the support he needed, and this was the beginning of a new chapter in his life. Keanu Reeves, having learned about the development of events, remained in the shadows as usual. He knew that his role was just a catalyst for change, and that was enough for him. When the woman and the homeless man finished their conversation in the park, the changes that had begun with that one day continued to spread. The woman not only promised to help the man find housing and a job, but also decided to go further by launching her own initiative to support people in need. This decision was born out of a sense of guilt and a desire to correct the mistakes she had made. She approached several charitable organizations, offering financial support and her involvement. She also organized a meeting with her wealthy friends, urging them to join the project. They didn't take her ideas seriously at first, but eventually agreed, seeing her sincere desire to help. A homeless man, now named Tom, was the first to benefit from the initiative. Thanks to the woman's efforts, he received temporary housing in a social center and a place at a vocational retraining course. This gave him a chance to start a new life. Tom worked on himself with extraordinary perseverance, taking advantage of every opportunity he was offered. Meanwhile, the woman tried to change herself not only externally, but also internally. She began to spend more time with volunteers and people who were involved in helping others. She learned about the real difficulties faced by people on the verge of poverty and realized how important it is to be humane and open. Her former arrogant lifestyle gradually gave way to a more modest and meaningful one. Social media, which used to actively discuss her negative behavior, now began to praise her for her changes. People wrote about how important it is to recognize your mistakes and correct them. She became an example for many, showing that even the most stubborn stereotypes can be overcome. Against this background, Tom was also going through his own changes. He shared his story at meetings and charity centers, telling how important it is not to give up, even when it seems that the whole world is against you. He recalled the day in the park when everything changed and thanked everyone who gave him a helping hand. His story inspired other people in a similar situation and motivated them to fight for their future. Keanu Reeves, who remained out of the media spotlight, learned about all these changes through social media. He saw how a small gesture of kindness turned into something bigger, and it made him feel proud. But as always, he stayed on the sidelines, avoiding unnecessary attention. All that mattered to him was that the result of his intervention mattered. A few months later, the woman organized a large-scale charity event in the same park where it all began. The event was dedicated to supporting people in difficult life circumstances. She invited volunteers, charitable organizations, and people who had gone through hard times and managed to rebuild their lives. The event featured tents where people could get legal advice, medical care, and even listen to lectures on financial literacy. Tom was one of the guests at the event. He took the stage to share his story. His speech was simple but sincere. He talked about how one meeting changed his life and how important it is not to lose faith in goodness. His words drew a standing ovation from the audience, and many came up to him after the speech to express their support. A woman standing backstage watched as people reacted to Tom's words. She felt proud and relieved. Her efforts were not in vain. She had contributed to making the world a little bit kinder. At the end of the event, people continued to share their impressions and stories. The woman's charity project was widely supported, and many people offered to help. It was the beginning of a new chapter for both her and those she was able to support. This story is an example of how one event can become a catalyst for change. The meeting in the park reminded us that every gesture matters,